Okay, good guys. Do you guys want to check out something?
Okay.
First of all, do you guys know what this thing is here?
A meteorite?
It's what?
A meteorite?
A meteorite, exactly. Yeah, and you used the right word for it, so that's pretty cool. Do you know what the other words that sometimes people call this are?
Meteor?
Sometimes you hear meteor. Any other words?
Comet?
Comet. Well, a meteor can look a little like a comet. Yeah, and sometimes people call it that. But in science, we like to call the thing that streaks across the sky a meteor. This thing, before it landed on Earth, was called something else. Before it fell through the sky, it had a different name. Do you know what it might have been called?
Shooting star?
What's that?
A shooting star?
A shooting star? Well, when it falls, that's when it's called a shooting star or a meteor, right? Not a meteorite, a meteor, right? Check this out. Take one of these. You know what these are?
Magnets?
They're what?
Magnets?
Magnets, that's exactly right. So check it out. Put it on the meteorite. Right. So what does that tell you about it?
Core is made of iron.
The core, maybe the inside of the meteorite is made out of iron. It's a good guess, maybe. In fact, the whole thing is made out of iron. Okay. Yeah. So magnets stick to metal. Not all metal. Magnets stick to iron and certain kinds of metal, but not all metal. So the fact that the magnet sticks tells us it must be made out of iron. You guys know where this came from. You already told me, right? From space, right? Do you know how it formed? Like, how come a rock would go up in space? Does that make sense?
Comes off of the planets, or is it?
Ooh, that's a part of the story, yeah. Do you guys want to start the story from the beginning?
Yes.
Okay, let's start the story from the beginning, but you have to help me, okay? The way you're going to help me is I want you guys to use your hands to help me demonstrate the story. So you'll probably want to put down the magnet, okay? Okay, so first of all, before this thing existed at all, way before the Earth even existed, there was little bits of dust. And can you do dust with your fingers for me? Okay. Little bits of dust, sparkling dust in space, floating around. What do you think might happen to those pieces of dust if they get close together?
Might form and conjoin together.
Kinda, yeah. In fact, that's exactly one of the things that happens, right? So these little pieces of dust, get your dust particles out there, right? They'll start to stick together, okay? They'll join together and they'll form little blobs. Now, those dust particles are made of lots of different things. They're made of metal, like this, and they're made of gases, like in the air, and they're made of water and ice, and they're made of rock. And when they start to stick together, they form little globs. You want to do the little globs for me? We call these little globs chondrules. And chondrules are teeny, tiny little globs, okay? But then what do you think if those chondrules start to get close together? What do you think might happen?
Bigger.
So maybe they'll form into a bigger chondrule. If they're solid, if they're not melted and liquidy, then they'll probably just stick together, right? And so eventually the chondrules will stick together. Can you imagine like millions and millions of chondrules sticking together and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger? Now, when it gets really big, what would it call a big, giant, round thing floating through space? A planet?
Or a comet?
Or, well, it depends on what it's made out of, but I would say depends on how big it is, what it's made out of, where it is, that kind of thing. But when it's really big and it's just mixed up bits of chondrules, then we call that a planetoid or a planetesimal. So it's kind of usually smaller than a planet. Maybe it'll get big enough to be a planet eventually. Okay. But what happens is when these chondrules stick together and get big enough, they start to get squished together really hard. When it's really big, they start squishing together, and then they get warm inside. Do you guys know what happens when something gets warm inside?
It starts to melt.
Will start to melt, right? Do you know what happens to the atoms and molecules when they get warm?
Like burn out.
They don't burn up, no. Something else happens. What were you going to say? Do they melt? Well, yeah, the way they melt is they start to move around. That's what heat is. That was what warmth is when molecules are moving around. So those molecules start to melt and move around, and the heavy stuff, like the metal, starts to sink towards the middle of the planetoid. Can you guys do it with me? Sink towards the middle. And then the light stuff, like the rock and lava. Do you guys think of rock and lava as being light? Are rocks light? They're kind of heavy, right? But compared to the metal, the rocks float to the outside. Okay, and then eventually they may cool down, and so you get a rocky outer layer and a metal inside. Okay, a metal core like you were saying before, right? Now, if you put your planetoids out there. Now, if these big planetoids that have a metal inside and a rocky outside start to bang against each other, what's going to happen to them?
I'm gonna separate. Or
Yeah, so, well, they may separate in what we'd like to call an explosion or, right, a collision can blow apart a planetesimal. And so the outside pieces, the rock pieces, can fly in all different directions. The inside pieces, like this, millions, actually billions of years ago, the inside pieces of a planet, of a planetoid, broke apart. And this is one of those pieces, the metal from the inside. Now,
That's the inside
what's
of
that?
the planet.
Yeah, this is the inside of a planet, exactly.
So that's a core of the planet.
Well, it's a part of the core of a planet. Yeah, it was probably much, 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 much bigger. Can you imagine two giant planets like hitting each other, breaking apart? Well, after that happened, after this piece started floating around in space, okay, when it's floating in space, we have a different name for it than the ones we've mentioned. When it's in space, we call it a meteoroid. Have you heard that term before? So I think of it this way, it's like if a meteoroid is floating through the void, right? Floating through the void, meteoroid. Right? Now, if it gets close to Earth, what could happen to it?
the
I could get caught in the atmosphere.
the gravitational pull will pull it into Earth and that's how
Yeah, those two things, exactly, right? So the gravity can pull it, and then it can fall through the atmosphere, and when it falls, when it soars across the sky, right? It burns up, it leaves a big streak, looks kind of like a comet, or we'd call it a shooting star, a little different from a comet, but it's flying through the sky, okay? When we watch it soar, we call it a meteor, that's the way I remember that. And then what happens when it hits ground?
it's just big,
On meteorite?
if there's a big explosion and big craters.
Yeah, so it can explode and form a big crater, and it's called a meteorite if there's a piece left. So if it hits the ground, then it might become a meteorite. But oftentimes they just blow up and disappear. Pretty cool, huh? You guys can check out the magnets here if you want to.
It was like I think it might have been a couple of weeks ago when meteorites fell in Scotland in Edinburgh.
Really?
And they said there's like big flashes in the sky like lightning.
Wow,
When it burns.
I didn't hear about that, but it would look like that, right? Did you see any of them, or?
I live in Ireland. I'm just on
Okay.
holiday.
Well, welcome. I hope you're having fun. Cool. What part of Ireland are you in?
Northern Ireland.
Oh, I visited Northern Ireland a few years ago. Where?
Pittsburgh.
What part is that in? I don't know. I went to Belfast and I went up
Yeah,
sort
this
of the
one's
north.
near Belfast.
Okay, very cool. I really liked it. It was a lot of
I'm
fun.
leaving here.
Okay, thanks for coming. Pretty cool, huh? So you can take these magnets if you want to and try them on the different meteorites and see if they all stick to the magnets. You want to try it? Okay. So just bring them back when you're done.
Okay.